Welcome to the Chapter 6, Part 2 lecture video on motivation. In this lecture, we will discuss contemporary theories of motivation while acknowledging some accuracies and problems with them. Whereas in Part 1, we reviewed a historical theory of motivation, that is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we will now review 5 more contemporary theories, including equity theory, expectancy theory, goal-setting theory, psychological empowerment, and reinforcement theory. The first contemporary theory of motivation we will discuss is equity theory. Equity theory argues that motivation is the result of a comparison of the perceived discrepancies in inputs and outputs of yourself relative to others. Inputs include things like effort, time, and resources, whereas outputs include the quantity and quality of outcomes. So with equity theory, I would think about my inputs and my outputs, my effort, my time, my resources, and then the quantity and quality of those outputs. So what I'm getting out of that effort. And then I would view that in comparison to other people. So do I think that my inputs and outputs are comparable to others? Do I think that if I'm putting in the same amount of effort as someone else, our outputs should be equitable? And if they're not, then that would be a discrepancy. In considering equity, there exist 4 types of justice employees normally consider. The first is distributive justice, which arises when the distribution of outcomes are fair. That is when the end result is equitable. So with distributive justice, we're focused on outcomes. Next is procedural justice, which arises when processes are fair. And to help you remember this, think procedural P and process P. Is the process fair? Is the procedure fair? Next is interactional or interpersonal justice, which arises when there exists fairness in social interactions. And with this one, I just try to remember interactional and interpersonal. Both of those words deal with some type of social interaction. So this is social interaction fairness. And lastly is informational justice, which arises when there is fairness in the quality of information received. Now, whereas justice reflects perceived fairness, injustice would reflect perceived unfairness. So just like I can say that there's distributive justice, there could also be distributive injustice. And that applies for the other ones as well. And equity theory argues that when inequity or unfairness is perceived, employees make one of 6 choices. They can change their inputs, they can change their outcomes, they can distort perceptions of the self. They can also distort perceptions of others. They can choose a different referent or comparison group. Or lastly, they can leave the field or quit the job. So let's work through an example of how these 6 options work. Let's say you get an unfavorable performance evaluation at work. Relative to your peers, your manager ranks your performance as only moderate, such that half of your peers overperformed you and the other half underperformed. Let us assume you feel the outcome of the performance evaluation is unfair. You have several options to remedy this perceived unfairness. Your first option is to change your input, meaning that you increase or decrease the time, effort, and resources you put into your job. Your second option is to change your output, meaning that you increase or decrease the quality and quantity of your work in response to the perceived unfairness. Your third option is to distort your perceptions of yourself. One way this is done is by inflating or deflating self-perceptions, your ego, your self-efficacy. Your fourth option is to distort perceptions of others. So you may say to yourself, the reason some of my coworkers outperformed me is because they have way more experience. It isn't because they're better than me. Your fifth option is to choose a different referent or comparison group. So instead of comparing yourself to coworkers who outperformed you, you could compare yourself to those who underperformed. And lastly, you can leave your job and end your employment with the organization. Now, one of the main issues with equity theory is that if people truly strived for equity in all situations, then they would also avoid inequitable situations in their favor. For example, let's say that you received an A+ on a paper when everyone else in the class got an A-, even though the quality and quantity of all the papers is equivalent. So everybody did the same amount of work and the quality is identical. This example would reflect inequity in your favor. You're receiving an A+, everyone else is getting an A-. Would you complain that you received a better grade than everyone else and demand an A-? Most people would say no. However, if grades were reversed, where you received the A- and everyone else received an A+, almost every single one of you would probably complain. And because most people wouldn't complain in both situations, equity theory isn't 100% accurate. Another contemporary theory of motivation is expectancy theory. Expectancy theory argues that motivation is fostered when an employee believes that effort will result in performance, aka expectancy, that performance will result in outcomes, aka instrumentality, and that those outcomes will be valuable, aka valiance. A good example of this theory is to think about your motivation in the course. The most motivated students have a confidence that if they try hard, they can do well on assignments. That's expectancy. They also see a clear linkage between doing well on assignments and earning a good grade. That is instrumentality. And finally, they see a lot of value in making good grades. That is valiance. So, to emphasize this again, when we believe there exists a link between effort and performance, that would be high expectancy. If we think that effort is not linked to performance, that would be low expectancy. If we believe performance is linked with outcomes, that would be high instrumentality. However, no link between performance and outcomes would be low instrumentality. And lastly, if the outcomes of performance are perceived to be valuable, that would be high valiance. If they are not valuable, then that would be low valiance. Now, goal setting theory argues that conscious goal setting motivates behavior, meaning that setting goals is important for job performance. More specifically, goal setting theory argues that assigning specific and difficult goals will lead to higher levels of performance when compared to assigning broad and easy goals. The specificity and difficulty provides employees with an anchor or measurable stick to gauge their behavior, which acts as a motivator for employee performance. That being said, you want goals to be difficult but not impossible. Goals perceived to be impossible will entirely hinder motivation and performance as depicted in the figure on the screen. Furthermore, goal setting theory also argues that participation in the goal setting process increases performance, such that when employees can provide their own insight and have autonomy in what the goal is, they demonstrate higher performance. This occurs because employees often set more specific and more difficult goals for themselves than an external person would. And because the goal is more difficult and specific, as we mentioned previously, this results in greater effort and increased performance. Additionally, self-set goals initiate the development of task strategies, which can be thought of as a unique problem-solving approach to achieve success. And these task strategies allow employees to work smarter rather than harder. Beyond goal specificity, difficulty, and whether the goal is self-set or set by another person, goal-setting theory also argues that feedback is important for increasing performance. Without feedback, employees wouldn't know where they stand relative to their goal or even relative to others. Task complexity also matters for predicting performance. Tasks that are complicated or change frequently can increase performance as employees need to consistently readjust their standards, providing them opportunities for learning and skill development. And lastly, having commitment is better than having no commitment. And one way to increase goal commitment is to develop SMART goals, or SMART goals. So overall, with goal setting theory, we would want to develop goals that are SMART. That is, we want to develop goals that are specific, the S, measurable, the M, achievable, A, so being difficult but not too impossible, relevant, R, being connected to what matters, and then T, time sensitive, having a predetermined completion time and date. Another contemporary theory of motivation involves the idea of psychological empowerment, which argues that motivation arises when an employee believes what they do contributes to some larger purpose. And psychological empowerment reflects intrinsic motivation. Empowerment arises when work is perceived to be meaningful and self-determined, and when it provides competence and seems impactful. Work is meaningful when it is perceived to be valuable and purposeful relative to one's passions and interests. Work is self-determined when it provides the opportunity for choices or autonomy. Work provides competence when there are opportunities for learning, skill development, and self-efficacy. And lastly, work is impactful when it is perceived to make a difference. The last contemporary theory of motivation we will discuss is reinforcement theory. Reinforcement theory argues that behavior and motivation is caused and reinforced through reinforcers. And reinforcers are any consequence that immediately follows a behavior which increases or decreases the probability that behavior will be repeated again. And reinforcement can happen via classical conditioning, operant conditioning, or social learning. Classical conditioning arises when a conditioned stimulus becomes linked to a conditioned response. And a famous example of classical conditioning is Pavlov's salivating dogs. For a full explanation, take a few minutes to review the following video and stop it at the 2-minute and 20-second mark. Now, reinforcement can also happen via operant conditioning when a positive and or negative reinforcement or punishment is linked to behavior. And a famous example of operant conditioning is Skinner's experiments with mice. For a full explanation of operant conditioning, take a moment and finish the rest of the video you started previously. So you're going to start it at that 2-minute and 23-second mark. And lastly, reinforcement can happen through social learning. Social learning argues that people learn through observing or watching others and through direct experience. Importantly, social learning can only occur if the following conditions are present. The person must have attentional capabilities. That is, they must be able to focus and pay attention long enough to learn. The person must also have retention capabilities such that they can remember what the behavior is and what the outcomes of that behavior are. The person also needs to have motor reproduction capabilities, where they're physically capable of mimicking or replicating the behavior. And lastly, there must be reinforcement processes present such that the behavior is perceived to be rewarding and is mimicked, or the behavior is perceived to be punished and subsequently avoided. A classical example of social learning is Bandura's Bobo doll experiment, which you'll learn about in the additional required reading sections of this module. Okay, that is it for our review of Chapter 6. If you have any questions, as always, email me at samantha.jordan@unt.edu.